Okay, good evening, members, ladies, gentlemen, and not too many members of the public. Welcome to tonight's Planning Policy Local Plan Committee meeting. The meeting, it's been streamed on YouTube, and the recording of that will be available on the council website thereafter. There's no fire drill planned for this evening, but should the fire alarm go off, the next sit over there, and maybe two at my back here. We'll all meet in the foyer if need be. Thank you. Okay, so we'll go to apologies. Agenda item 1, apologies substitution. Ian.
Thank you, Chairman. I can report apologies for absence this evening from councillors Maria Fowler, who has a prior family commitment, and also from Councillor Jane Chapman, who unfortunately has had a bereavement in the family only today.
Thank you very much. We go to agenda item 2, the minutes of the last meeting, which was held on the 5th of October. They've been circulated. Are you happy for me to sign them? Thank you. Agenda item 3 is declaration of interest. If anybody's got anything to declare, now's the time, or when the item is debated. Don't see any hands coming up. Thank you, members. Agenda item 4 is questions pursuant to Council Procedure Rule 38. Do we have any?
None received, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Item 5 is public speaking. There are no members of the public this evening, so we'll skip to item 6, which is review of the local plan, which is hopefully will initiate the process. This report will formally initiate the fast approaching 5-year review. As a reminder, the local plan was approved in January 2021. Therefore, the due date is January 2026. Gary will very shortly go into the details of the process, but I would just say that in order to meet this deadline, we really need to submit the updated plan by June. That's our deadline that we're going to work towards. So that will give us an extra 15 years lifespan and will take us to 2041. So without any further ado, Gary, I'll pass over to you. There is an updated sheet that's been circulated on the NPPF, which happened yesterday. But again, I think you'll cover that in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Also, thank you. Good evening, councillors, and good evening to those watching online. So, as the Chairman has rightly said, January 2021 was when we adopted Section 1 of our new local plan, and that was followed in January 2022 by Section 2. And although the current local plan has been designed to guide development in our district up to 2033, it is a requirement of planning legislation and national guidance that we keep the plan up to date and that we review at least every 5 years. Now, this is to ensure that local plans remain fit for purpose, that they align with the latest in national planning policy, and we've had a very recent change in planning policy only yesterday, and that we adjust to in response to changing circumstances which will come about over a period of time. And as you'll see from the update sheet, the government published a new version of the National Planning Policy Framework only yesterday, and it places more importance than ever on the need to have an up-to-date local plan. And because the process of preparing and reviewing and updating local plans includes a number of stages, including the gathering of evidence, the carrying out of consultation, engagement in the communities, and an examination by a government-appointed planning inspector, it can be a lengthy process and not one to be avoided or left too late, as the chairman rightly said. So leaving it too late and being in a position where you have an out-of-date local plan that hasn't been reviewed within 5 years can have serious repercussions, not least the return to unplanned and unwanted speculative development proposals, and an expectation which is actually enforceable by a planning inspectorate to grant planning permission for such developments. And I remind councillors, and particularly residents who may be listening in tonight, that a large proportion of the housing development that has happened in our district in recent years and that is under construction today was actually granted on appeal. And that was at a time when the council's local plan was out of date and we weren't able to demonstrate a 5-year supply of deliverable housing sites. And Mr. Woods will talk a little bit about 5-year supply under report A2 a bit later. We have various examples throughout the district: Missley, Great Bentley, Elmstead Market, Alresford, Thorpe Le Soken, Bromley Road in Ardley, Freighting, Little Clacton. These are all notable locations where rapid and piecemeal development has taken place, mostly off the back of decisions by government planning inspectors against the council's wishes and the community's wishes. So keeping the local plan up to date is key to that never happening again. But it will still require difficult and brave decisions to be made by this council that are not always going to be popular, such is the duty bestowed upon us, the local authority, to plan positively for growth in our area. So with the blessing and the guidance of this committee, we're asking tonight to kickstart the mandatory 5-year review of the local plan, with the aim, as the chairman rightly said, of submitting the plan to the Secretary of State by June 2025 and to be examined and adopted by January 2026. And there's a couple of reasons why we're working to those timeframes. The first is that we need to have reviewed the local plan within 5 years of adopting the current one. And by that, we do mean 5 years from adopting section 1 of the local plan, which was 2021, because that plan contained the housing and employment targets. So we need to work 5 years from January 2021. And the second reason is that the government is making some quite significant changes to the process and procedures for local plans and the format of those local plans. And they will apply to plans submitted to the Secretary of State after June 2025. And the changes that the government are proposing would actually require quite a fundamental rewrite of our local plan, as opposed to a more focused update as we're proposing in this report. And I'll cover that a little bit later. So the report before you highlights the various stages of the plan making process, and when broadly we will look to deliver those stages. I think there may be an error on one of the pages in terms of the year, but the key date is submission by June 2025. But we will look to bring back an updated local development scheme to this committee in the new year. And that local development scheme, or LDS, that will actually contain a more detailed timetable of all of the stages of the plan making process. So to help us to work out what parts of the local plan we might need to focus on when coming to undertake this review, officers have carried out an initial appraisal of all the policies in our current local plan, and that's contained in Appendix 2 of your agenda, starting on page 27. And that exercise looks at the requirements of national planning policy, albeit it changed yesterday, so we will have to revisit that in light of the changes that were made. But it also comments on the experience or the difficulty that we may have had in implementing some of those policies in the determination of planning applications. And it refers to relevant appeal decisions and other changes in circumstances. I'm not going to go through the table in great detail because it is a work in progress, and we will update it and it will evolve throughout the process. But it provides us with a useful starting point to identify which areas we definitely need to focus on in the review and which areas perhaps we don't need to spend so much time on. Now, that exercise has in turn enabled officers to develop a set of overarching guiding principles that could underpin the approach that we take to the local plan review. And those principles can and will be kept under review as we work on the local plan process, and in time will be the subject of public feedback in their own right. But as a starting point, we think it's important to have some basic foundations to work from, and we will certainly be seeking your thoughts on those tonight. So if I can take councillors to Appendix 1, which starts on page 19 of your agenda. Chairman, if you're happy for me to take a bit of a canter through these 32 principles, and I'll highlight specific matters in here that may be of particular interest to the public as we go through. So there's 32 principles here. The first is the focus. So as I've mentioned, the suggestion here is that rather than completely rewriting the local plan from scratch, we approach the review in a focused way that looks to update the local plan. So keeping the best of what's in there and then updating the areas that need to be updated and extending the time frame of the local plan in doing so. That will have consequences for topping up the supply of housing, employment, land to meet longer term requirements, but essentially we would have the current local plan as our starting point, look to update and improve upon that. The process I outlined earlier is that the aim would be to follow the current plan making rules in place rather than the new ones that the government are looking to introduce June 2025. And to do that, we would be looking to submit the plan by then. The evidence. So local plans have to be underpinned by a proportionate level of evidence. And sometimes these studies can be very time consuming and quite expensive. And in undertaking a focused review, it means that we can undertake and commission the evidence that is specifically required to update the plan in the way that we're suggesting here. And at a time when we need to think very carefully about value for money, of course, for our residents, we are looking to achieve an efficient use of resources to deliver this local plan update and avoid commissioning work that doesn't strictly need to be commissioned. So some of the nice to haves might not necessarily be on the priority list for this review, the local plan. Status. So as it stands at the moment, we have a local plan that is in two parts. Section 1, strategic across North Essex, and Section 2, which is specific only to tendering. The intention here is that the new local plan would replace both of those, and that we wouldn't necessarily be tied to a North Essex local plan. We would take the policies we would need from Section 1 and add to Section 2, and we would have one consolidated local plan for tendering. And that is the approach that we understand Colchester will be taking, and the approach we expect Braintree will be taking as well. And the significance around that really relates to the garden community, which I'll speak to in a moment. Time frame. So the suggestion is here is that the current local plan is designed to run to 2033. The suggestion here is we extend the lifetime of the plan by 8 years to 2041. And the main reason for that is that under national policy, there's an expectation that your local plan should cover a 15-year period from the point of adoption. So if we do successfully adopt this new plan in 2026, 15 years hence from that would take us to 2041. Page 20, the format of the plan, following the general principle that we would be updating rather than rewriting the local plan, is that the general look and feel and the way that the plan is presented, the broad order of that the policies are presented, we would look to keep fairly similar as we have now. Partly to avoid unnecessary changes, but also because people would have grown a degree of familiarity with our local plan. And if we can keep a level of continuity in the way it looks and the way people can understand. That was okay. Thank you, Chairman, for the benefit of the public. My microphone just switched off, so I'm using the Chairman's one. The garden community. Is it? Oh, that's just typical, isn't it? So the garden community, Tendring Colchester Borders garden community, that's a long-term development, and the growth of that area will extend into the next plan period. And the intention, therefore, is that we carry that forward into the next version of the local plan. And to achieve that, we would seek to have a single policy for the garden community, which would be the same for Colchester in their equivalent local plan. And that would fulfil any requirements under duty to cooperate. And what that policy would do, it would refer to the development plan document, which is currently being prepared. We're expecting to be examined by the inspector in the new year. But it would also set out what the agreed position is on the division of housing and employment land numbers between the two authorities as to how much it contributes towards each council's respective housing and employment targets. The place to do that would be through this policy. Strategic policies, this is quite a straightforward one. The current version of the National Planning Policy Framework requires councils to specify which of the policies in their local plan are considered strategic. So we would just make sure that those policies are highlighted specifically in the plan. And one of the specific reasons why we need to do that is that for neighbourhood, the purposes of people doing neighbourhood plans, they need to comply with strategic policies in the local plan. So you need to be quite clear on what the strategic policies as opposed to the non-strategic policies are. The local plan contains an overarching vision and a set of objectives, and as published in the Section 2 2022 plan, that was the vision for our district to 2033. Now, in broad terms, we wouldn't expect the vision for the district to 2041 to be significantly different from 2033. But there is one notable change in circumstance which we may need to reflect on, and that's the designation of Freeport East and the consequences and the opportunities that could arise from that. So that would be something that we would be focusing on specifically, which wasn't mentioned at all in the previous local plan because it's something that's come along later, and the current status of Bathside Bay as well, which has changed quite recently with the implementation of the Planning Permission plans for development at the Bay. Settlement hierarchy relates to the list of settlements and categorisation of those settlements in our district, from the major towns at the top to the smaller villages at the bottom, where the expectation is the larger towns would receive the larger proportion of any future development. The smaller villages proportionately would expect to take on less because they have less in the way of services and facilities, and being smaller, proportionately, they're sensitive to big growth happening. The intention would be that we would look to carry that forward as a principle into the new local plan, But once we understand what the future housing and employment requirements are in terms of numbers, it may require us to look at that situation again if that level of growth can't be accommodated in the traditional manner. But that's something that we will come to later in the process when we have a clearer understanding of what longer term development projections are going to be. Neighbourhood plans, we already have an adopted neighbourhood plan in Oxford and 2 emerging plans at a very advanced stage in Ardley and Elmstead. And through the local plan, we would look to give greater recognition and encouragement to neighbourhood plans that are in the process and those communities that are thinking of pursuing a neighbourhood plan for their area. Settlement development boundaries. Now, people that are familiar with planning will know that in our local plan, we have red lines drawn around certain settlements. This is the one for Brightlingsea. And these are designed to determine the areas within and out of which we would encourage development. The intention that would be that we would carry forward that kind of policy, but that to respond to the longer term need for development, there may be a need to adjust some of the boundaries to accommodate land. As I say, we don't know what the scale of development is at the moment. That's something we need to work on. But the principle of having a red line outside of which we are stricter than we are inside of which is something that we would look to carry forward into the new plan. Quality, high quality, beautiful and sustainable design. The current local plan has fairly good policies on achieving quality in design, but there's a greater emphasis on beauty now. And that's coming through very strongly in National Planning Policy Framework and in the announcements by the Minister yesterday and in the new version of the National Planning Policy Framework. So our local plan will need to reflect national policy, and there's an opportunity to embed beauty as one of our ambitions within the plan. Information requirements. So a number of our policies in the local plan allow certain things to happen if the right information is provided. For example, the redevelopment of a community facility, if it can be demonstrated that it's no longer viable or there's an oversupply in that area. We may look to provide a bit more guidance, perhaps as an appendix to the local plan, as to what we would expect applicants to actually provide us with those planning applications. Whereas at the moment it's quite open to interpretation. Maybe an opportunity to provide a bit more help and guidance along those lines. Open space and sports provision. This is an area where we will look to review the local plan to ensure that the approach we're taking is the right one. And also the council will be progressing open space and sports strategies in the new year. And we want to ensure that the policies in the local plan reflect those and achieve the best outcomes in terms of the provision of open space, sports provision, green infrastructure, having regard to the pattern of development and the best way that those facilities are provided to our communities. But also the emerging requirements for biodiversity net gain and ecological mitigation, which I'll come on to a little bit later. Cemeteries and crematoriums, we have a very, very brief section in the local plan that covers that. But more recently, we've seen the emergence of different types of burial, whether it be woodland burial, aquamation, which is another one that's come through. And of course, in extending the local plan forward to 2041, we'll need to consider whether there's a need to make additional provision for burial. So that's why we've highlighted that as a principle. The one that is probably going to be of most interest to our community is housing requirements. And in rolling the local plan forward to 2041, there will be a need to consider what additional housing is going to be required and what we would need to provide for through the local plan. But we're in quite a good position in the sense that some of the developments that are in our current local plan were actually designed to extend beyond the current local plan period of 2033. So, for example, the garden community is the obvious one. I mean, that's got a sort of 20 to 30 year life to it, so that would extend into this plan period, and the one beyond that, probably the one beyond that. And some of the big developments around Clacton, including Hartley Gardens, Rouse's Farm, Oakwood Park. Those developments that are in the current local plan are expected to contribute to the development that would be required between 2033 and 2041. But what we will need to do is understand if there's a gap in that provision that needs to be met by additional sites added into the local plan. And as mentioned in the document here, we can identify sites that can deliver 10,000 homes. So we need to understand whether there's a residual gap to 2041 that needs to be met by additional housing provision. And in doing so, we will then need to consider what options are available for accommodating that growth, because one of the requirements of the planning system is that we consider different options and we appraise those options before coming to the final selection of the way forward. And of course, the higher that housing requirement is, the greater the challenge is going to be in identifying those sites, because we already know from our current local plan there's a very limited supply of brownfield land in our area. So the strong likelihood is if we need to up the numbers considerably, that would have implications for greenfield land releases in different parts of the district. And we would need to consider a whole range of options before coming to a preferred solution as part of the plan making process. And one of the things that we're proposing in this report for the new year is that we carry out what we call a call for sites exercise, where we invite primarily landowners, developers, but it's open to anyone that has an interest to put forward suggestions for sites, developments, proposals. And it doesn't necessarily have to be for housing, it could be for commercial, it could be for biodiversity net gain, it could be for open space, it could be for sports provision. But by going out and trying to understand what ideas landowners have, it will give us a bank of evidence and information which can help us to try and generate some options that we can bring to members for consideration and then out to the public for consultation in due course. So we would look to carry out that initial exercise early in the new year as an evidence gathering process. So page 22, part of the way down, limiting additional growth around Clacton and the garden community. So what this is about is if we're extending the plan period to 2041, and we know that the garden community and the sites around Clacton are going to be carrying on and they're going to be delivering housing within that extended period. On the face of it, there appears to be no merit in trying to allocate additional sites on the edge of Clacton for that period or around the garden community, because allocating additional sites is not going to make those developments happen any quicker. If anything, you dilute the market demand and you might slow things down if you get the balance wrong. So the suggestion is here, and we know we will get objections to this from landowners that want to develop their land on the edge of Clacton or around the garden community. But the suggestion is that land around the edge of Clacton and land around the edge of the garden community area falls beyond the scope of our local plan review, and we won't be looking for additional land for development in those locations above and beyond what's already in the current local plan. And related to that is strategic green gaps. So the next point down, we have a number of strategic green gaps designated in parts of our district where there are concerns that settlements are eventually going to sprawl and coalesce into one another. We've particularly got them around Clacton, we've got them in the Kirby area, we've got them in the Mandatory Lawford area, and we've got one around the garden community in that as part of the DPD, which we may look to extend as part of the local plan review. So the principle here is that we wouldn't look to make those gaps any smaller. We would look to try and maintain the gaps that we have in the current local plan or expand upon those gaps. As I say, we will be challenged for that. There will be landowners that will argue opposite, but I think there's good reasons to have that as a principle. Particularly as we've only recently adopted this local plan on the basis of evidence that suggests those green gaps are sound. So why would we change it only 2 or 3 years after we've established them? Page 23. We're getting there eventually. Do slow me down if you're losing me at all. 10% on smaller sites. National Planning Policy Framework has a specific requirement or a specific expectation that at least 10% of the new homes delivered through local plans should be on smaller sites of less than a hectare in size. And that's no bad thing in a way, because when Mr. Woods reports some of the housing figures later, part of the success of delivering good numbers in recent years has been that the contribution that a variety of sites across the district have made towards housing delivery. And the fact that some of the smaller sites can be delivered out by local house builders. It's not all about the national house builders. By having a variety of sizes, you can cater for the economies of local house builders, the one-man bands, the small to medium-sized enterprises, and the big boys in terms of the volume house builders as well. So if we can, it would be our intention to have 10% of whatever the growth requirement is on smaller sites of less than a hectare. And that size of site generally work quite well in rural areas because they can be achieved at a scale which is sensitive to those locations and doesn't result in an overwhelming of the infrastructure in those locations. Community infrastructure levy. This is another area where government are potentially looking to make some changes, but community infrastructure levy is a means by which you can secure financial contributions from new development across a range of scales. So even from single dwellings all the way up to the major developments that can be pooled to be spent on the infrastructure that's required to support that growth. What we have at the moment is Section 106 legal agreements, which ties financial contributions very much to the development that is proposed and doesn't necessarily allow much freedom to be able to utilise that money for other areas of the district where there may be a priority need to deliver infrastructure. And also with Section 106 agreements, which will still remain in force, we'll still be using those for the larger developments. But because they can't be applied to lots of small developments, it means you can have a lot of small developments that don't make any contribution towards the infrastructure of the district, and therefore the cumulative effect of lots of small developments can have a significant impact on infrastructure that we can't mitigate. Through community infrastructure levy, you can mitigate it. And if we end up with a strategy where we're going to have a lot of small sites coming forward for development, this could be the means by which we deal with the infrastructure requirements off the back of that. And the suggestion is here that we actively explore the introduction of community infrastructure levy, and we undertake the evidence that we need to be able to bring that into force. And we're currently working with Essex County Council to deliver some of that evidence. Housing mix and affordable housing, we will need to revisit through evidence what the right mix of housing is for developments in the district and what the right level of affordable housing is to meet the need. So that will require update to our evidence on housing need and housing mix. So that would be an expectation of the evidence that we update. Self-build and custom-build homes. This is something that the government is very much behind, enabling people to build or commission their own bespoke house, their dream house. And we have a policy in the local plan which is designed to achieve that, but the instances that these schemes come forward are very few and far between. And I think we will take the opportunity to see whether there's anything we need to do to that policy to allow for more of that development to come forward. Because at one end you've got your affordable housing, you've got your volume house building, you're going to have your smaller developments that are suitable for rural areas. But in that mix, there needs to be a provision for people looking to build their own home. And we'll review whether our policies work for that purpose. Gypsies and travellers, there is a statutory requirement through the local plan to consider the needs for gypsies and travellers, which may or may not require us to identify land for that purpose. Like the housing figures, we don't have the figures on what the need for gypsies and travellers are going to be going into the future, but that is something that through Essex County Council and our colleagues across Essex, that is work that has been commissioned, and we expect to have something reported back in the new year, which will feed into our consideration of this issue. We're nearly there. Employment land of Freeport East. So employment land in the current local plan, we provide for a significant amount of employment land, which some might argue is too much employment land. But we did that on the basis that it provides choice and competition in the market so that we can attract a variety of different businesses to the area, and we can respond quickly to changes in the economy as and when they come up. One of the big game changers for tendering potentially is the designation of Freeport East and the incentives and the opportunities that arise from that. So it only seems right that we take the opportunity to review whether the supply of employment land in our district reflects the maximum opportunity that could come about as a result of Freeport East and the progress that is being made in the development of Bathside Bay. So we would look to commission some technical evidence around that, which may or may not lead to identifying some additional sites for attracting businesses into our area, enabling businesses to evolve, expand, relocate within our district so that we can maintain a strong economy. Ecology and biodiversity net gain, a legal requirement starting next year is the requirement for 10% biodiversity net gain on developments. So any impact of development on ecology is expected to mitigate that and make up for it with a 10% on top. And there's lots of guidance still coming through government as to how that is achieved. But what we do know is that our current local plan doesn't reflect that ambition because it wasn't a requirement at the time the local plan was emerging. Is a requirement now, so we will specifically review the local plan in relation to biodiversity net gain and even explore the opportunity whether we should be allocating land through the local plan, not just for housing and employment, but also for ecological purposes to enable that biodiversity net gain to be achieved. And a number of Essex authorities are exploring the possibility that we extend it to 20% or even beyond. So that's something that we can be looking at. And through the Call for Sites exercise that we're looking to run in the new year, we will be encouraging people if they have land that they think could provide biodiversity net gain, because there is money to be made from that as well, the opportunity to bring those sites forward for our consideration. On town centres and retail, we don't see such a fundamental review required on that. Our evidence on town centres and retail is fairly up to date. The situation with retail is different now than it was many years ago, when there was a strong push for more retail out of town shopping centres. The economy has changed. What we're seeing now is more the sort of retraction of town centres and business moving online, and we feel that the policies that we have in our current local plan already reflect that. So if anything, it will be a light touch review of the policies around town centres and retail. Holiday and caravan parks, likewise, we have up-to-date policies in the local plan, but we are aware of the sort of growing trend for park homes and the demands for improvements in the quality and efficiency of caravans and chalets. And we're also aware of the challenges of occupancy conditions and making sure that people are living on caravan sites for holiday purposes rather than residential purposes. And if they are there for residential purposes, should we be enforcing against that, or should we be looking to accept some of that if it results in a better quality of life for people? That's something we have the opportunity to look at through the review of the local plan. Nearly there, only a page to go. So landscape. We last did a comprehensive landscape character assessment in 2001. It was one of the first things I was involved in when I joined Tendring District Council. That's 22 years ago. It's probably about time we had a look and see whether that needs to be updated, particularly given how much development has happened in the district over the last 20 years, and that there have been changes in the way that the landscape is used, whether it be wind farms, which we've seen around Clacton, solar farms, residential development. There have been changes in the landscape of Tendring, and we will probably look to have our evidence on landscape character updated as part of the local plan review. Climate change. We thought we were quite innovative with our local plan because our policy was very forward thinking in terms of how we encourage developers to think widely about the kinds of renewable energy installations, the kinds of energy efficiency measures they should put into new development. But it just shows you how quickly the world moves, because what was innovative a couple of years ago when we adopted this local plan is already out of date. And we know that through our work with Essex County Council, there is a series of policies that is even more up to date, been tested for viability to achieve the best standard of energy efficiency, water efficiency, and general response to climate change. And we will look to embrace those new emerging policies through the review of this local plan. And last on the list, but certainly not the least, and certainly in the eyes of residents across the district who may be listening in tonight, transport. One of the key issues for our district. Of course, in extending the plan period to 2041 and considering whether there is additional need for growth, we will need to consider the data we have on transport. We will need to work with the Transport Authority to model any options that we generate for the purposes of its local plan. But we will do so knowing that Essex County Council is progressing transport strategies for the districts across Essex, and will be starting work on the tendering one in the new year. And we will seek to achieve alignment with our transport strategy with our local plan strategy, with an overarching principle really of trying to get walking, cycling, public transport as attractive and as convenient as we can to reduce reliance or manage the reliance on private cars. And that will be in the way that development is designed. It will be in the way that development is located in different parts of the district, and it will be reflected in the investment that we hope our colleagues in transport will be able to make in our district in the future. And it may have implications for the use of community infrastructure levy as well. So although it's the last point on there, I don't think I can emphasise enough how important the transport network is to the success of any plan for growth, whether it be economic growth or housing growth in our district. And through the review of the local plan, we will need to cover that. So those were the core principles which your officers would be happy to be challenged on and asked questions on. And so, Chairman, if I can bring the committee's attention to the recommendations in this report, which are on page 11 of your printed agenda. And Chairman, I'll leave it up to you whether you want me to read them out or whether you'd prefer to read them out. But as a broad overview, the recommendations are to start the process of reviewing the local plan, commencing the 5-year review, noting the content of this report, consider the principles, noting that we will bring back a local development scheme containing a detailed timetable, and that we would look to run an initial call for sites consultation exercise in the early part of next year to gather evidence for us to consider options. And Chairman, I'll hand back to you and leave you with those recommendations, and happy to answer any questions.
Gary, thank you very, very much for a very comprehensive run through the areas of focus that you will be looking to update the local plan. I'd flashback of your old boss, Malcolm Insker, when he talked about 22 years ago when you started the landscape as your first job. So that's a long time ago. Yes, before I go to members for questions, the one thing that I've meant to mention at the beginning was that we're looking now to introduce 2 bi-monthly meetings, regular meetings of the committee. This, what Gary's gone through, is giving you a very good flavour of the amount of work that needs to be done. So by scheduling regular meetings, we will be monitoring it, will be on top of that, and we'll keep everybody focused on that. So there will be dates circulated in the new year. So as soon as you get those, please give me your diaries, and so that we've got them and we all know where we are. I'll go to members for questions. I'll go on to comments that somebody might like to come up. Members, do you have any questions for Gary? Zoe?
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, Chairman, I'd like to I suppose it is a declaration of interest in some respect in the fact that, I'm from a farming family. We have land within the district that may well be affected by this. I've taken the view that this is very much looking at the review of the local plan as a whole, and it's very high level, and therefore I don't feel that there is any conflict there, but just declaring. Thank you.
I understand you've discussed this with the monitoring officers at the time, and that the advice was that whilst it's all high level and strategic, you're fine to carry on being part of that. Thank you very much. Any other questions for Gary? Councillor Bush.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank Gary for a really clear, concise report. It gives us a really good direction. But what it also does, it actually is forward-thinking already of our plan to review it going forward, which is a really, really important document. And every time I'm understanding more about the process that we need to go down, how important it is that we get ahead of the game in where we are. And one of the other things that sort of stood out for me, and I think Gary emphasised it, so many of the different principles, was the transport provision, and maybe with the introduction of the community infrastructure, it could really help some of these rural areas of connectivity if this gets put into place, and we have a clear strategy on that, which for the rural areas will be a really key need to be addressed amongst many of the others. And obviously with climate change, I'm told it's one of the big key areas for me, and always looking to where we can improve energy efficiency and reduce carbon. I think some really good stuff here to look at amongst all the other items. But all I would like to say there, Chairman, is that we're sort of very proactive here in going forward with this in the plan. I think it's a really, really good start.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and I agree with Councillor Bush, the rural community, in terms of the transport vision. In my part of the world, we have a station, but other rural communities that want to connect, there's no up and down, there's left and right, go to Colston, out again. But going from north to south in the district might be something to look at. Going from, say, Great Bentley to Brighton Sea, or from Freighting to Alsford, there's no up and down. There's left and right, but not up and down. So there's something we need to look at. You mentioned, Mr. Guyver, about neighbourhood plans. Yes, one of my villages in my ward recently had a vote about a year or two ago with reference to the neighbourhood plans. I've been interested to know, would these neighbourhood plans will have to update their neighbourhood plans to go in line with our neighbourhood plan going forward, or will the neighbourhood plans in those said villages, one Elson Market's coming up, and I know in Councillor Farley's area in Ardley, will they have to update their neighbourhood plans on, say, every 5 years, or is that set in stone for as long it needs to be updated in those said areas? Settlement boundaries. I brought this up previously in the last administration. There's like, for example, in Great Bromley, there's Balls Green, there's Freighting, there's no dividing line, but there's no settlement boundaries around there. I know in central Bromley and other places there's a settlement boundary, but in outer like Ardley Heath, Burnt Heath, Bromley Heath, Balls Green, there's no settlement boundaries. I was wondering, do they come under the small settlement areas, or would they have its own sort of remit of settlement boundaries? Because people live in those communities would like to see a settlement boundary, in particular Freighting up to Balls Green and Hare Green. I think those communities would like to have a settlement boundary, but that might be something we need to pursue in the future. I'm interested in what you said about the community infrastructure levy. I'm very keen on that. And finally, I don't know other councillors whether their residents in their areas get asked this kind of questions, but in certain areas of TDC, we have like a small pockets of communities, like in Elpston Market, where we have about 40 to 50 one-bedroom apartments for elderly residents who want to downsize from, say, 3 beds down to, say, one-bedroom apartments, where they don't want to leave the community where they know their friends are and their social network is, but there's no provision for people to downsize and stay in their areas. And I was wondering if there are any small pockets of communities for elderly population in particular. I know they have in St Osiph, and I know they have that in Elpston Market, but I know residents in Alsford are keen to have small pockets of communities within the villages, so elderly people who live on their own and want to downsize and free up a 3-bed house for younger families. I don't know whether there's something we can possibly look in the neighbourhood plan. The local plan for the future. There's something I did brought up about 4 or 5 months ago with Councillor Bush, and maybe having a new housing levy where it pays towards recycling provision. So when new houses are built, and then we have a levy to pay for recycling facilities like green bins and boxes, because I know we have to pay out for them in another department. I would have thought, with all these houses being built, on a similar side, like to Rams, where it's £12 something for Rams, may have a small figure where we could have, when new houses are built, and to pay towards environmental things like boxes and wheelie bins and so on. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Scott. So I'll attempt to take those in the order that they were mentioned. So in terms of the transport and improving connectivity between different parts of the district, that is something that we will need to look at in coordination with Essex and what they're doing on the transport plans. And it may be that certain options for growth in the district facilitate those kind of connections better than other options do. So when it comes to looking at, okay, what is the scale of housing or employment development we might need to accommodate, one of the things we can look at when we're looking at options is, well, how is that going to resolve some of these issues around transport connectivity, if at all, and how can we use development as a tool to achieve transport objectives in the district? And that's something that we'll look to explore when we look at options alongside the work that we're doing with Essex on transport strategy. On neighbourhood plans, there's been a little bit of a sort of very recent development on this, because there was a tweak to the MPPF that came through this morning, which was a correction to the one that came through yesterday about neighbourhood plans. And we haven't sort of fully digested exactly what it means. But like local plans, there is an expectation that neighbourhood plans need to be reviewed on a rolling process. Where you've got a local plan under review and a neighbourhood plan in place as well, it's a little bit of an iterative process where when we review our local plan, we will be taking into account what the neighbourhood plan says, but also if we do understand that there's a big amount of growth, we will be probably looking at parishes that have neighbourhood plans to reflect that in their review of the neighbourhood plan. So it's a bit of a rolling programme. We're never going to be completely lined up at any one time. But as neighbourhood planning groups come to review their plans, they will need to take into account where we've got to with our local plan and what our expectations are. But equally, when we review our local plan, knowing what Alresford and Elmsted Market and Ardley are doing through their neighbourhood plans is going to help us immensely in understanding what the right strategy for the district is for those areas. But there have been some very recent developments on the need to review neighbourhood plans and how regular that has to happen. And perhaps we'll come back to the committee once we've fully understood what those tweaks actually mean. Settlement boundaries. There are a number of settlements, as you rightly say, Councillor Scott, that aren't defined within settlement development boundaries, and for that reason they don't feature in the list of settlements in the settlement hierarchy, and they're not earmarked as locations where we would direct development. Through the review of the local plan, we will revisit that. We may have to revisit that once we've understood what the scale of growth we're dealing with is, because it might require us to think about the settlement hierarchy in a different way. When it comes to delivering development in rural locations and thinking of some of the smaller developments that we'll need to accommodate as part of our 10%, there may be a scope to bring some of those smaller hamlets into settlement boundaries so that they can help us to accommodate that growth. And I always say to those communities that are aggrieved by the fact that they've been taken out of the settlement boundaries, in some ways it's a good thing because it means they're not the focus for development. But in other respects, I think they feel a bit isolated from the planning process because there's no recognition to their community in the local plan. This is the time to review that, and we will be reviewing that, but we're not intending to divert too far from the current hierarchy, but where there are obvious examples where we might need to look at it again, we will do. Community infrastructure levy, yes, I mean that provides the means by which a whole range of developments can contribute towards infrastructure, particularly important if you are going to have development in the rural areas. Less so if all your development is in one block on the edge of a town, because you can deal with that in one go under Section 106. But in a semi-rural location like Tendring, if you are reliant on development spread around, you need to be able to make sure that the money you secure from that development delivers the infrastructure that serves the whole of the area and deals with that cumulative impact. So, like you, we're keen to explore that opportunity. Downsizing. So as part of our local plan review, we will be looking at the mix of housing that is required across the district. We know, because of the demographics of our district, that there is a strong demand for retirement. There is a strong demand for people looking to want to downsize from larger properties into smaller properties, and thus freeing up the larger properties for families and what have you, which is all part of the housing market churn. And we are aware of Alresford's neighbourhood plan ambition to achieve that kind of development as well. It does happen in the district. It's not something that we insist on in the current local plan. It's something we will be looking at. But interestingly, another change to the National Planning Policy Framework gives a lot of support now for community-led development. whereby if there is a community that knows that there is a specific need for a particular kind of development in their area, they can bring that forward as a departure from the local plan. And it's something that councils would be expected to support. So hypothetical example, if there is a village where there is a known need there for smaller dwellings to meet the needs of that community, but the local plan doesn't provide the land for it, or the land's not in the control of someone that can deliver it, they can work with landowners to bring forward a scheme for that village, which includes the right kind of development for that location, and that the council could approve as a departure from the local plan because it's community led. And that may well be something that we see more of in the future, and something that will probably reflect somehow in the text of the local plan when we come to review it. In terms of new housing paying towards the provision of recycling provision, that's something that we can explore across the services of the council to see whether that's something we do. Certainly, if you've got a big development like the garden community, for example, which would have a specific stewardship arrangement in place for it, it may well be that you can cover that kind of provision through the stewardship arrangements. On other developments where the traditional approach is that they build, they pay their council tax and they get a bin, that's sort of the traditional approach. That may be something that when we look at the way that waste provision is dealt with, if there is a way of linking it to the requirements of the local plan, I can't make any guarantees, but we'll certainly explore it.
Can I say, Chairman, I'm very grateful for Mr. Guyver to come and give me some really good responses, so much appreciated.
I'm right to understand that I will remove the arguments of viability from developers, because everybody will know what the tariff is, so they wouldn't be not getting away from it. There are cons, of course. That's part of that will have to be passported out to the relevant town and parishes, a proportion of that, and you could have local communities arguing, well, I've had development in my neck of the woods to pay for infrastructure elsewhere. So those are the kind of arguments or debate that we need to have around that. But what are your thoughts on that, Gary?
Thank you, Chairman. So with the community infrastructure levy, yes, because you do the viability assessment up front before you introduce community infrastructure levy, it takes into account what the likely viability is going to be. And the way that it comes about is you have to assess how much infrastructure you're going to need to support the growth that you're proposing and the cost of that infrastructure. And then you have to offset that by how much money you can reasonably get in from the developers. How much can they realistically afford to pay? Now, normally there is a gap. So normally the amount of money that you get from SIL is not sufficient in itself to pay for all of the infrastructure that you're required, but it gives you the starting point when you're talking to the county council about investment in roads, if you're talking to government about investment in other infrastructure, but you've secured as much as you can from development. And when you set the levy, that is the levy that the developer is expected to pay, and there shouldn't be any argument about viability. The argument about viability would be had as part of a specific examination for the community infrastructure levy, which is separate to the examination for the local plan, where the inspector, and it would be a government inspector again, would be specifically looking at how much is it reasonable for developments to afford. And that can vary in different parts of the district. You may have different rates in different parts of the district. And as you rightly say, Chairman, it may be that money secured from one part of the district is spent on the strategic infrastructure that is actually located in another part of the district. But it gives the council the flexibility to spend that money in the way that it feels is right, rather than being tied down to specific developments, which is what Section 106 does at the moment. And you're also right, Chairman, that a proportion of money secured through SEAL goes to the relevant town and parish council, and it's a higher percentage if they have a neighbourhood plan in place.
And they've also got to have fully evaluated projects in order to access the funding. Am I right?
It's less critical under SEAL to have fully evaluated projects, but the difference between Section 106, where you are tied into delivering specific projects, and SEAL is that you are judged almost sort of at a political level, really, on how wisely you've spent that money.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Councillor Cousins to the next.
Right, I'd just like to put on record that I endorse the approach we're taking. I think Kirby was one of those areas that did get hit by the fact that we didn't have a local plan in force at the time. I was interested with the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act of 2023 that Braintree are going down the route of a new type plan. Are Colchester, and are we putting forward a problem for later on, or would we be rewriting our plan in total anyway come 4 or 5 years time? So are we putting aside a problem that might be greater in the future, and is there any way we can address maybe putting something aside to cope with that at the later date when we have to rewrite the plan in total? And the only other question I was going to say on the principles that we've laid down, the housing mix and affordable housing section talks about 10% of houses being affordable home ownership. Now that's specifically saying ownership rather than what we have been in the past, allowing a percentage to be affordable, whether it's for rent or home ownership. My concern there is that we have had schemes forward like that in Thorpes Oaken, etc., to shared equity type schemes. They haven't been taken up, and then they tend to be bought up by housing associations. Is that potentially what could happen with this 10% affordable houses that has to go for home ownership? Will that end up in some of the housing associations, which haven't always been the best landlords, you know, for place shaping of your village, etc.? My other concern on the housing and affordable housing mix in local areas is, reading through your report and some of the work we were looking at, is that some of these self-built and custom-built homes could end up on the outside of settlement limits in villages in exactly the same sites as the exception type properties, which we have struggled to build under rural community council and things like that, haven't really managed to build the properties for, you know, local young people to move into. So is that going to impact on that, and should we be looking at how it is going to impact on exception sites as well?
Thank you, Councillor Cousins. So the changes that the government are proposing to bring in are aimed primarily at speeding up the rate of producing a local plan, because, as we know from our own bitter experience, it can take a number of years. And the approach we're looking to take here is the traditional approach, albeit by taking a focused approach, we'd do it quicker than we would do if we were rewriting the plan from scratch. But the way that the government is looking to speed up the plan making process, in part, is that the local plans themselves would be dramatically simplified from the local plans that we have now. And they would have very simple maps showing basically areas where you can develop, areas where you can't, and areas where you might be able to develop under certain circumstances. And it strips out a lot of that very specific local detail, which is quite important to the current type of local plan. It does allow you to bring that forward through neighbourhood plans and through supplementary guidance, but it's not quite the same as having a comprehensive local plan which deals with those local issues. The other thing that they're looking to do is to nationalise some of the policies that would apply to new development. And to be fair to the government, actually, a lot of councils have policies that are quite similar for dealing with planning applications. But that would be another way in which you would have a national statement of planning policies rather than a local set in your local plan. Eventually, depending on what happens nationally with governments and what have you, potentially, yes, we are putting off the inevitable. And when we review the plan next time round, we'll be caught by whatever those requirements are. But through a combination of needing to have updated our local plan by 2026 anyway, which requires us to submit before June 2025 anyway, and the fact that we avoid having to rewrite the plan from scratch and confusing everybody, the suggestion here is that we go with the current system. That's what Colchester are proposing to do as well. They're approaching their review of the local plan in a similar way to us in some respects, but in a very different way in others, because they are opening it up a bit more to looking at a whole variety of topics, whereas we're trying to be quite focused. Yet Braintree are, our understanding is that Braintree are going to embrace the new system that's coming through from government. Of course, Braintree, following the Section 1 local plan, came out of that process in a very different position to Colchester and Tendring, because we secured the garden community, whereas the garden communities proposed for Braintree didn't make it through that process. So Braintree in a somewhat different position and have a different perspective than perhaps Colchester and Tendring do. Sorry, yes, 10% affordable home ownership. So that's a requirement that is in the National Planning Policy Framework, was in the National Planning Policy Framework when we progressed the local plan. But what you were allowed to do, if the priority local need for housing was something different to this kind of housing, you were allowed almost an exemption from it. Because if income levels, household income levels, are so low that actually only social rented housing is the only solution for a large proportion of the people on the housing waiting list, then probably affordable home ownership is not going to be the product that's going to meet their needs. But going forward, and we will keep it under review, we are working on the basis that we'll have to comply with the national policy, which is that 10%. So if your requirement is 30% affordable housing, a third of that, as a result, would be for affordable home ownership. But that's different to shared ownership and intermediate products. That is actually a housing product that you essentially buy outright, but through some kind of legal mechanism, it can only ever be sold on a proportion of market value. So if it's, I don't know, if it's only 80% of market value, when it's sold on, there'll be a covenant that requires it to be sold on next time at 80% of market value, and so on and so on. We don't have any experience of that product in our district, and I must confess I don't know of any particular examples in Colchester or the wider area of this. It's something we'll have to research more before we finalise our approach. And self-build, custom-build homes, yes, potentially you've got competition there, because potentially the site that might make a good exception site for affordable housing might also make a good site for self-build housing. But our policies in the current local plan do allow for both. And it's possible that you could have a hybrid of the both, actually, where you can have a proportion of affordable housing to meet that need, but then a proportion of market housing to help pay for and deliver, cross-subsidise the affordable element. And although we don't have any examples in our district, there's no reason why the market element of a rural exception scheme can't be self-build. And that's perhaps something that we need to look at as part of the review as well.
I was going to say the last point I totally agree with. I mean, I think we did have aspirations, Brinton Walton at one time, you know, to build some houses on exception sites, and those sites didn't really come forward. But I can see that there is potential that the exception sites definitely won't come forward because there'll be more lucrative things to do with it. So I think if we were to be looking at maybe a hybrid type system so that we do keep some of those houses potentially to come forward, then that would be good.
Yeah, community-led developments, I would imagine, if a community group, whether it's parish council, town council, or anyone else want to, kind of come up with something different, that's a very good thing to do. Before I go to Councillor Fairley, on affordable housing, we've not really achieved historically the 30% that we set out to do. Just try to understand a bit more on that and what the proposal are going forward. Obviously 30% is not a realistic figure. And whilst you do that, what's your thoughts on gifting? I know we kind of paused that because there were appeals that were inspected have not criticised the council, but commented that because of gifting, affordable housing wasn't getting delivered. So what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Chairman. So the local plan requirement is for on large developments to secure up to, it's deliberately up to because sometimes you need to argue viability, 30% affordable housing. The need for affordable housing as a proportion of the total housing needed in the district is roughly 30% as well. But the reality of the situation is that you can't achieve 30% across the district. And that was recognised by the planning inspector that allowed us to proceed with the plan, because the 30% requirement is only going to apply to sites above a certain size. So the smaller sites, or the 9 or fewer kind of developments, don't provide 30%, so they're kind of off the hook. They're not caught by the policy. So it only really affects those larger developments. And depending on the location of that larger development and any of the constraints affecting it and the state of the market, there can sometimes be an argument on viability to go for a lesser figure. And as a result of that, because you can't achieve 30% on the small ones, and you can't always achieve 30% on the large ones, you'll never achieve the full 30% for the whole district. To help to achieve that, you have things like the rural exception policy. You have good working relationships with housing associations that might be able to deliver the odd 100% affordable scheme in the right location. There was one at Delfords in Harwich, which was affordable, 100% affordable housing scheme to help top up that number. But what you sometimes find from developers and landowners as part of the local plan process, they'll suggest that if you increase your total housing number, say if it was 10,000, they said if you build 15,000 houses, then you can deliver 30% and you can meet all of your affordable housing needs. But the problem with that is that houses will only be built at the rate that the market can sustain that kind of development. And if you saturate the market with too many sites, you don't deliver the figures anyway. So there's a sweet spot. And I think with the local plan and the report that Mr. Woods is going to bring us shortly, the sweet spot I think we've achieved here, because we're delivering good numbers and we're starting to deliver some affordable housing. But because of those constraints, the 30%, as best as we try, is always going to be a challenge to actually achieve. We can only do what we can. Gifting. So the situation with gifting is that a few years back, we found ourselves in a scenario where registered providers, housing associations, weren't able to access the funding that they needed to be able to buy from the developers the houses and to rent them out a proportion of market value. And because of that, we faced a situation where no affordable housing was going to get built at all because it wasn't viable for the registered providers. So an innovative approach was that during that period where it wasn't viable, we could actually have an arrangement with a developer by which they would build some affordable houses and gift them either to a council or to a registered trust, but it wouldn't be at a discount of market value, it would be for free. So they would build them and they would transfer them over. But as a consequence of that, you would get fewer numbers. So, for example, if it was a scheme of 100 and you were expecting 30, actually, if they're going to gift the houses over to you rather than sell them to you, they can only afford to do that for a smaller number. So you might only get like 6 or 7. That worked when we needed it to work, but the consequence is you don't deliver the affordable homes that you need in total. And therefore, it's not a sustainable approach to continue in the long term. It may be something that we have to revisit in certain circumstances, but the general approach now is that we seek 30% affordable housing on site, which is provided at a discount, rather than handed over, a small number handed over with the keys.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you. I think one of the most controversial things that's brought up as from residents is where people have retrospective planning for various types of applications, and there's lots of reasons behind, variety of reasons behind what can, what is required for retrospective planning. But I guess the perception is that planning rules are perhaps being bypassed by some developers, and so I just wondered, does that, where that and how that would fit within local plan policies? Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Fairley. Well, it's somewhat separate to the local plan, because although the local plan sets out the policies by which you would determine the applications, what it doesn't do is legislate for when you put a planning application in, what the fees are, whether you can accept them, validate them legally, that kind of thing. So the issue with retrospective planning applications, and governments have looked at this to see whether there's anything they might be able to change in the system, and it may be something that they do through the next lot of reviews of the planning system, is from a local authority perspective, we have to treat them exactly the same way as we would be treating a planning application where the development hasn't happened yet. We've almost got to treat them as if the development wasn't there, and have to treat them exactly as the same as we would do a fresh application. Hugely frustrating, because the public perception is they've got a head start because they've already built it. What are you going to do about it? And of course, even through our enforcement powers, we have to act in a proportionate manner, and we have to take into consideration what the likelihood of success is of getting enforcement action on people that have built things that haven't got permission. But I'm afraid that probably the local plan isn't the right place for that. But when we keep an eye on changes that the government making to the planning legislation, to which we are bound when we determine applications, it may be something that they bring in. But successive ministers have looked at this again and again and see whether there's some way of increasing the fee for a retrospective application was one suggestion. I think they have tightened up the rules on people applying for planning permission over and over again for the same thing, which is a slightly different thing. They've tightened up on that. But no, I can't offer you much comfort on that particular issue with regards to the local plan review, I'm afraid.
And so if we'd finished with the questions, I'm quite happy to move the recommendation on page 11.
the new requirement through the NPPF about the beauty. How do you define beauty? Does it mean that anything that's ugly you you reject? And what do you define as ugly? You know, so I'd be quite interested to understand that.
Thank you, Chairman. That's the $65 million question, that one right there. So duty to cooperate, yeah, it still exists, but it's not as onerous as it used to be. So, for example, for the duty to cooperate, there was an expectation that you had to carry out an assessment of housing need across a wider area with other authorities, and you all had to agree on it. You don't have to do that now, but you do still have to demonstrate that you've worked with, considered, and been considerate to your neighbours in your approach to planning, because they are, of course, consultees on the planning process for updating the local plan. The obvious example, of course, is our border with Colchester, where we have a shared baby in a sense. We have a baby together with the garden community, and where we're suggesting here a joint mutually beneficial policy in the local plan. But in the past, we have had good engagement with BABA through the duty to cooperate, where we've needed to comment on their emerging plans, we have done. Where they've needed to comment on ours, we have done. We've always found a way forward, and the duty extends to considering planning applications as well. And a great example of that was when we had a big planning application in Brantham at the same time as a big planning application in Lawford and one in Missley, and we worked with BABA Council and Suffolk County Council to come up with a Section 106 package that worked both sides of the river. So that's an example of how we've engaged positively with BABA. And we also share the Suffolk Coast and Heaths area of outstanding natural beauty and part of Denham Vale as well. So there are duties around that are shared between authorities too. And beauty, how do you define beauty? Well, I think the expectation coming through national planning framework and changes to the planning system is that councils will have design codes for their areas that pick out specifically what is beautiful and characteristic about their areas and how they would expect that to be reflected in new development that happens in that area. Now, in Essex, in a way, we're quite at the forefront of that because we were the first county to have a design guide, the Essex Design Guide 1973, which has been updated year on year after that. So we're sort of seen as best practice in terms of design coding. There'll also be a design code for the garden community specifically, and I think there will be a growing expectations that design codes will be used for other developments and across districts as well. So my understanding is that is how government expect councils to achieve beauty by embracing the opportunity of having design codes.
Gary, thank you very much indeed. From the questions, I don't think there's any, I think there's a general assent into the principles that you've identified, and that will be your work going forward. Councillor Cousins moved the recommendation. Councillor Scott's moved it. All those in favour, please show. It's unanimous. It's remiss of me not to have invited Councillor Baker to, you are the cabinet member for planning and you are here in that capacity. Do you have any comments on what's been discussed tonight?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad you're going to be meeting every couple of months. As you have just voted on the first lot of recommendations, there's so much work to be done. And I have great confidence in the team that it will be done, and we will get to June 2025 and we will have submitted, not committing the team to anything, but we will have submitted a review, because I don't want us to be named and shamed by Mr. Gove or whoever might have his position in the future. But I think it's a fantastic report. I read it with anticipation actually, and listening to your debate, I think there's been some very good questions come out, some of which I've scribbled down, and the answers, because there's a couple of things that I might want to take forward with Mr. Guyver. Yeah, but, thank you very much. Thank you.
That is that if we over deliver over any year, it does not count on any future deliveries. So it just shows the importance of sticking to what we plan for and not to overdo things, because you cannot, it's like some phone providers, if you've not used all of your data, you cannot take it forward. That's it, you've lost it. And I think that's the same principle with the houses there. Okay, so over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. The purpose of this report is to update the committee about matters relating to monitoring the local plan, particularly around housing delivery, the future housing trajectory in the district, the current 5-year housing land supply position, and the preparation of a new authority monitoring report. You may have noted on the update sheet that there is a correction to a typing error in the report. There are 3 places where it refers to the financial year 2021-22, and whereas the monitoring was actually undertaken for the most recent financial year, 2022 to 23. So the data that's reported is correct for that period, April 22 to March 23. And that's made clear elsewhere in the report. But just for clarity, on page 41 in the purpose of the report section, and page 45 in the first and third paragraphs, those references should be to the most recent financial year. Both of the documents referred to in the report, the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, which we call the SHLA, and the Authority Monitoring Report, the AMR, are essentially factual documents. They don't include strategy or decisions, but they report on what has happened, and in the case of the SHLA, what we expect might happen over the coming years. They're documents which form part of the local plan evidence base, and they're published on the council's website. So turning first to the SHLA, the new MPPF that was published yesterday says that we no longer have to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply for determining planning applications, as long as our local plan isn't more than 5 years old and it sets out a 5-year supply of deliverable sites for housing at the time that it was examined, which ours does. And so it means that the SHLA document, which has been so pivotal in recent years in determining planning applications and also in determining appeals, will be less important for development management over the coming years. But it is a very useful document still, because it monitors how much housing has been delivered, but it also helps us to understand how much growth is likely to occur in the district and whereabouts that growth is likely to happen. And it's used by colleagues who deliver infrastructure, such as the Education Authority, the Fire Service and the NHS to plan their services. But it's also going to be a valuable piece of evidence for our local plan review in understanding what housing allocations may be required to extend the plan period to 2041. So despite the changes to the MPPF yesterday, it's currently anticipated that officers will continue to review the SHLA document annually following each financial year. So the headlines from this year's SHLA are that 810 new homes were delivered in the year 2022 to 23. That's net of demolitions and other losses such as conversions. That's the sort of the increase in homes within the district. 654 of those were on large sites of 10 or more dwellings, and 156 were on smaller sites of 9 or fewer. And 60 of that total in the last year were delivered as affordable homes. We arrive at these figures from a number of sources, primarily through site visits, where officers visit sites annually to determine how many completions have occurred, but also through conversations with developers themselves, looking at building control records, the public council tax valuation list, and also up-to-date aerial photos. This is another year of increase following the dip that we saw in 2020 when building sites had to close during lockdown, and it demonstrates a strong market in the district. The chart on page 46 of your agenda shows the trajectory of housing delivery for the whole of the local plan period, starting in 2013 through to 2033. Section 1 of our local plan sets out that our objectively assessed housing need for the district is 550 homes a year. So that's the red line that you can see across the chart. And you can see that there was some under delivery at the early part of the plan period, which meant that in subsequent years we had to address that shortfall. This made demonstrating a 5-year land supply more difficult because the shortfall had to be accounted for too. But that shortfall was addressed fully, and now our 5-year supply calculation is much simpler. We go forward a couple of pages to page 49 of your agenda. It shows the 5-year supply calculation. which is 550 homes a year multiplied by 5. And then we add on a 5% buffer that allows choice and competition in the market. And that brings our requirement to 2,888 homes over the course of 5 years. But our trajectory from conversations with developers shows that we could deliver up to 3,717 new homes, which is 829 more than required, which means we can demonstrate a 6.44-year supply of deliverable housing sites, which is a very strong position for us to be in at the start of our local plan review. The second part of the report covers the authority monitoring report, known as the AMR. And this is the first AMR that we've completed since the adoption of the local plan in January 22, and it covers the same period as the SHLA, 1st of April 22 to the 31st of March 23. And it reports on the monitoring indicators that are set out in Chapter 11 of the adopted local plan. AMRs used to be a statutory requirement that were part of the council's formal annual monitoring to central government, but that's no longer the case. They're now a local tool to help us monitor the effectiveness of our local plan. And this AMR, as well as any future versions that are produced, will form part of the evidence base for the local plan review. So I'd just like to go through each of the sections of the AMR itself, just chapter by chapter, just to summarise what we're reporting. And so the first chapter, chapter 2 on page 56, is the local development scheme progress. Gary mentioned that the local development scheme sets out the timetable for producing the local plan, but also other planning policy documents. And so in the AMR, we just briefly set out the status of each of those documents: the local plan review, the garden community DPD, neighbourhood plans, SPDs, among others. But as mentioned in the previous item, we intend to update the LDS fully in the new year and then bring it back to this committee for consideration. The next chapter is housing, which begins on page 58. And it covers broadly the same information that I've outlined from the SHLA. It's like a summary of what is otherwise a 90-page document with the SHLA, with all of the statistics and the evidence behind it. But it also sets out the monitoring that we've done with regards to the self-build register. The individuals or associations of individuals can apply to join the self-build register that the council is obliged to hold to demonstrate their desire to build their own home. And there's legislation that sets out how the register should be run and what the council's responsibilities are with regards to it. And so on page 60, we set out how many people have been added to the register each year since it was established. We set out the methodology we use to determine whether a particular grant of planning permission meets the relevant definitions in the regulations. And then it details the number of service plots of land that we've granted suitable permission to. And the conclusion essentially is that we're currently meeting our obligations with regards to self-build and custom house building. Page 62 talks about employment, commercial and retail development. Firstly, we look at the local plan allocations for employment sites. Of the 32 hectares that we allocated in the adopted local plan, 29.9 hectares remains available for development, 11.2 of which has received planning permission and development has commenced on site. We can see that allocated sites are coming forward, with 3 of them having received consent so far and construction having commenced on 1. But we're still only in the 2nd year post-adoption of the local plan. So it's good to see that there is still land available for employment and commercial development, but also that the market is supporting development to come forward on these sites. We move on to commercial development, and a number of planning applications have come forward for employment uses on land outside of specific allocations over the year. And we've set out on page 63 that we've had 12 applications approved in the year April 22 to March 23, which represent an additional 9,700 square metres of commercial floor space. And there's details of each of those applications there. When it comes to the retail section, we're giving an overview of vacant floor space across the district's town centres at March 2023. And this really is just a snapshot in time, and it will be used for comparison purposes in subsequent versions of the AMR, and will also be able to inform updated studies to support the local plan review. But the general picture, as you'd expect, is that the larger towns have got the greatest floor space capacity, and that there are a range of units across the district ranging from 2,800 square metres at the vacant Sainsbury's site in Clacton, down to a small unit of 23 square metres that's currently available in Manningtree. The infrastructure chapter begins on page 68 of your agenda. It begins by setting out infrastructure projects that were delivered in the district over the year. And that includes 4 of the district's play areas being upgraded with money secured through planning obligations. 3 of them were delivered by the relevant parish councils, and 1 was delivered by TDC. And a larger scheme of upgrades at Clacton Leisure Centre. This chapter also reports that 3 larger development schemes have submitted details of ultra-fast fibre broadband that will be provided for their residents. And then there are sections specifically about health and education contributions. So £173,000 was secured through new Section 106 agreements in the year for health contributions associated with planning permissions granted in that year. And £125,000 was secured for education contributions. And we've also reported information we've received from colleagues in the NHS about the money that was secured through earlier planning applications, but that was spent during the 22-23 financial year. And that totaled £211,000. And there are details of where that money was spent and how it was used on page 69. Sustainable travel. It's just a short chapter on page 71. And it reports on some of the strategic work that's been begun in the district, particularly the tendering future transport strategy and the tendering local cycling, walking and infrastructure plan, both of which are being delivered by Essex County Council. And it reports on £104,000 that was secured from the St John's Plant Centre development towards upgrading bus services and creating safe cycle and pedestrian access. And at the bottom there, a travel plan was submitted to the council and approved for the development at Samphire Meadows, that's Turpin's Farm between Frinton Wharton and Kirby Lesoken. Page 72 is the chapter about the historic environment. And it looks at the council's heritage strategy and gives an update on the 35 actions and 3 local projects that were set out in that strategy, which was adopted in 2020. Since it was adopted, 3 have been completed, 25 are ongoing, and 10 are yet to commence. And of particular relevance to this committee is the work to review the conservation area appraisals, 10 of which have been consulted on, and updated versions are due to be reported back to members in the new year. And the remaining 10 will be consulted on during the course of the next year. The natural environment chapter on page 77 reports on the main indicator set out in the local plan, which is the implementation of the RAMS strategy, which seeks contributions from developers to avoid and mitigate the impacts of disturbance new developments cause to protected sites along our coastlines. Through these contributions, the Bird Aware team have employed 3 rangers who work along the county's coastlines to raise awareness of sensitive sites for nesting birds, with a particular focus on Colne Point and Point Clear Bay this year, which has seen the highest rates of disturbance. The chapter also reports on water management and flood risk, and it highlights the planning applications that the Environment Agency have objected to on the grounds of flood risk. Of those 3, 2 were refused, and the 3rd was approved once a flood risk assessment had been provided that overcame the Environment Agency's concerns. And finally, the tourism promotion chapter on page 79. It's just a short section which highlights the contribution that tourism industry makes to the district's economy, and the fact that the sector is worth almost £414 million to tendering based on a report from 2022, and it's responsible for almost 9,000 jobs. The tourism economy has grown by around 66 million since 2012, which acts as quite a useful baseline for the start of the adopted local plan period, and then gives us some information to use when we're reviewing the local plan. So those are the 2 documents that we're reporting on, the AMR and the SHLA, with a view to publishing them online and then using them as part of the evidence base for the local plan review. I will hand back to the chairman for the recommendation, which can be found on page 42 of your agenda.
Paul, thank you very much indeed for another extremely comprehensive report. And it's interesting to see the monitoring report, which speaks for itself, and it's a health check really on what we've delivered and what we haven't delivered. A lot shorter recommendation this time. It's the report is for noting, and I will go to questions in a moment. Just like to highlight the sustainable travel requirement, which Gary talked about before. It is very much one of Essex County Council's drivers into getting people to come away from the car. Our district, however, it's very difficult to retrofit with cycle lanes and other things. And you can achieve those where there are big roads, but as most of our district is made out by rural areas, it's going to be quite challenged. So you're going to have your work cut out there to cut through that. The one point that I wanted to raise when we had a briefing the other week, but the risk register on the historic environment, is there still a duty for the council to keep risk registers of buildings that need to be addressed quite quickly? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. On sustainable travel, you're absolutely right. There are challenges unique to rural districts like ours. I mentioned the tendering future transport strategy that Essex County Council are preparing, and there are ongoing conversations with officers from the district council and the county council to establish the vision and the objectives for that strategy, with a view to achieving a much better provision of sustainable travel, particularly around public transport within the district. You're absolutely right, it will be a high priority for the local plan review. With regards to the Heritage at Risk Register, that's something that is held by Historic England, and the council has an opportunity to make recommendations of properties or buildings within the district that are at risk and should be included on that register. I think in the AMR, on the Heritage chapter, it does mention that we haven't made any recommendations since, I believe, 2019. I think that during COVID, Historic England's schedule changed slightly, but certainly as part of the conservation area reviews, there are going to be certain sites and heritage assets that are going to come to our attention that we may need to make recommendations to with regards to them being entered onto the Heritage at Risk Register.
Like to make on that is the increase of commercial space. That's it's a very good indication that the district has been used by people wanting to invest, and which underpins other strategies that the council's got in growing the business rate. And it's really very, very pleasing to see that it's becoming a material achievement in front of our eyes. So it's really, really good. Excellent report. I'll go to members for questions. Members, do you have any thoughts? Councillor Fairley?
Thank you. Yeah, really, really good report, really positive report. It was great to see that 6.44% figure at this early stage. I think that's really, really good. And I was quite interested in, on page 60, you've got the self-building custom house builder register. I just wondered how is that publicised within the district? How do we go about making sure people are aware it's there and what they need to do to be on it?
So the legislation sets out minimum requirements for how council should publicise those registers, and essentially the requirement is that it be available on the council's website, that it can be referred to in monitoring reports such as these. So that's what we do currently. There is a web page on the council's website about self-build and custom house building. It gives some information about the background of the register, and there's quite a straightforward online form that residents are able to fill in. It asks the questions that are relevant to the regulations. There are certain requirements in order to be entered onto the register, but essentially it's just a case of filling in that form and then submitting it to the council, and then we have 28 days in which to respond and let them know that they've been entered. So it's on the council's website, and now it's going to be reported in the AMR as well. and that's the extent of the publicising at the moment.
Yeah, on that subject, an application comes to mind. We talked about the Green Gap earlier on, and the reason that it was an application which would have delivered all of our self-built requirements in one go. Unfortunately, the Green Gap, the Green Gap was a fault there for not allowing the delivery of the application, which but it's self-build is something really that we need to do to encourage a bit more really, and I think that's what was beyond the question, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wonder whether there's something we can do by way of press release or social media, etc., that would encourage.
Thank you very much. No other questions? We got a recommendation on page 42. Would someone like to move it? Yeah. Have a seconder? Councillor Bush. All those in favour? Unanimous again. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Oh, sorry, Councillor Baker. Sorry, come in. You should just get crashed.
I'll just go and stand outside. Yeah, very good. To have had this nearly a 6.5-year housing and land supply some years ago, we may not have seen some developments in the district.
Absolutely.
It's good news, isn't it? Thank you.
Yeah, those of us have been about for a while. We remember the 3%, the 3.1 year land supply that we had, and all this unwanted monstrosity that we've got now to live with. But there you go. Some of them are not too bad, but some of them are really not fit for purpose. But there you go. Far from to comment. Apologies, Councillor Baker, for not having brought you in. Okay, so we'll go to agenda item 8, updated statement of community involvement. This is a requirement that we must have in place before any work needs to can commence on reviewing the plan. I think our community involvement has always been very, very good. Always room for improvement, but I think what we got in front of us reflects more the position that we ever-changing world and the digital ability that the council has to engage with people. So I'll pass over to Will Fuller, who will take us through the report. Over to you, Will.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. Hope all is well. I'm going to hopefully get through this pretty quick because I think we all want to go home now. Okay, the statement of community involvement, the SCI, is really detailing the way officers consult with different groups, and it kind of splits out into our different planning functions. Now, the last time this document was updated was in 2020, and that was as a response to the COVID pandemic. The government wanted to try to get people to not congregate as much, and so in our planning functions, we took out a lot of things that said, meet in village halls and get together. So the last time it was updated was because of the pandemic. This new version kind of resolves that and goes back to more of a status quo. And also, it's a good position to update it now because we're about to embark on our new local plan. So now is quite a good time to do it. And I think it's important to note that the main change to this new SEI is about taking out that pandemic section. So that's an important thing to remember. The SEI does split into our different kind of planning functions. So it starts off with the most important one, which is the preparation of the new local plan, and goes through each individual function. So it begins with the local plan, then talks about planning applications and the development management process. Then it talks about development plan document, so things like the guiding communities, DPD. Then talks about statements of community. Then talks about supplementary planning documents. Then talks about the SCI itself. So this document itself also needs a consultation, and then ends up with a section about neighbourhood plans. Now, each of these sections doesn't just say the council will, speak to the public. It splits it out into different sections of the community. So it starts with talking about people that live close or within statutory sorry if I could even talk within housing allocation sites, within strategic sites. Then talks about the public generally, as a wider group, it goes through to talk about statutory stakeholders, so people like Natural England, Environment Agency, those kind of groups. It then looks at hard to reach groups, so whether that is the elderly, younger people, people with disabilities, and people of ethnic diversity, and kind of like really focuses on how do we speak to them? Can we visit them to get a better communication? And it for each one of those groups, it kind of specifically says how we're going to speak to them. So it could start with simple things like emails and letters, but also the councils this year started a new online consultation portal. So that's mentioned as well, and that kind of is a more interactive way for the council to kind of look at how we're going to consult with people. And then it also talks about the obvious things, which are going to village halls, also visiting schools and churches, those kind of places, and it kind of details those more more precise areas of consultation. So yes, I've kind of rushed through it a bit there, but yes. This document does look at the way we consult with the public as a whole, and the recommendation for you here is on page 81, which the chairman can look at. I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed for presenting the updated SCR. Members, do we know the report? Is there any questions for Will that you have to put, Councillor Cousins?
No, I haven't got a question. There's just one typo on page 110, I think, because it talks about Colchester Borough Council. Oh, no. It's now City, but
no comments on that. I think that's noted. Yeah. Excellent. Councillor Baker, any thoughts on this?
No, thank you, Chairman.
The second has been moved by Councillor Cousins and seconded by Councillor Fairley. All those in favour, please show. Unanimous vote. Thank you very much indeed. I think that takes us to the end of our agenda. There's no other business to be conducted. I wish you all a very, very happy Christmas. Enjoy your festive period. Don't drink too much, don't eat too much. And I will look forward to seeing you in the new year. Thank you very much indeed. Meeting closed.